Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Q&A. We're very excited to be here. My name is Caitlin Jetelina. I am an epidemiologist, also known as your local epidemiologist. And we also have Dr. Malia Jones here, and she is an epidemiologist and co-founder of Dear Pandemic. We are both moms. I am a mom of 2 under 5, and I'll let Malia introduce herself in a little. But we have both partnered with the COVID-19 Vaccine Equity and Education Project. And this is a coalition of over 200 patient and provider and public health organizations really coming together to answer parents' questions about the vaccines, to provide education and equity around the distribution of these vaccines as well. The project is convened by the Alliance for Aging Research, Healthy Women, and the National Caucus and Center on Black Aging. Together, its members represent a broad and diverse range of stakeholders that include nurses and teachers and first responders and trusted messengers, all who are critical to building confidence in the vaccine process and really the science, evidence-based data around the COVID-19 vaccines, which is key to contributing to addressing health inequities. And so these groups have come together to provide information about the clinical trials process. I think before the pandemic, none of us really paid attention to this process, but it's very important. Regulatory review, distribution, and access to COVID-19 vaccines in ways that promote equity and as well as trust. And while Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson have provided initial funding to support this project, its efforts are focused on education around COVID-19 vaccination more broadly, and the coalition does not advocate for any particular vaccine. Throughout today's conversation, we encourage you to use the chat box to share any questions that you may have. There were a lot of questions put on your local epidemiologist as well as Dear Pandemic that we've already polled and we're going to answer. But I know a lot of parents out there have really great questions. So feel free to put it in the chat box and we'll try and get to it in the next hour. And this is a safe space. There is no stupid question, I promise you. So feel free to ask your questions. We really want to make this conversation valuable to you all. And then I'll turn it over to my partner, Malia Jones.
Thanks, Caitlin. It's great to be here with you and with everybody watching today. I'm really excited to be joining you. I'm actually on vacation with my family. And like Caitlin, I am a mom. I have 2 boys who are 8 and 11 years old, going on 12. I have a PhD in public health and I study vaccine hesitancy. I've been studying vaccine hesitancy for about a decade, and I used to mostly focus on measles vaccine hesitancy. But of course, during the pandemic, that topic became a lot more salient to a lot more people. And so I was involved with launching Dear Pandemic, which is a science communication platform on social media for disseminating good scientific information, much like your local epidemiologist. So I'm delighted to be here, and I'm excited to answer all the questions that parents have about these newly authorized vaccines for little kids that we've all been waiting for so long. So I think we're going to first talk about the clinical trials process that led to these new EUAs. Caitlin, do you want to give a little overview of how this went down?
Yeah, sure. Happy to. So let's see. So Moderna and Pfizer conducted phase 3 clinical trials, and they were pretty large, actually. The Moderna trial was 6,300 children, and the Pfizer clinical trial was about 4,500 kids under 5 years old. And both of them, so the vaccines are a little different. So Moderna tested a 2-dose vaccine, while Pfizer tested a 3-dose vaccine. The reason Pfizer is doing 3 doses is because back in December, we actually found out that the 2-dose vaccine wasn't working very well. And we think that's because The amount of RNA in the vaccine was just too low to be effective, and so we needed a third dose. And honestly, it wasn't too surprising either, especially in the wake of Omicron, because even with adults, we now need 3 vaccines. Older adults need 4 vaccines to really mount a strong impact on Omicron. So it really wasn't that much of a surprise. And we do think Moderna, we're going to need a third dose for Moderna. Anyways, clinical trials happened. The purpose of clinical trials is to look at the safety as well as the effectiveness. And they found that the vaccines are very safe. Most kids did report pain at injection site. My girls got vaccinated yesterday and there was pain at injection site. I think that's just normal of vaccines. There were other side effects like fatigue and headache were most common in kids aged 2 to 5. And irritability and sleepiness was most common for our kids under 2 years old. Fevers were a bit common. I think it was about 1 in 10 kids got a fever. It was more common with Moderna than Pfizer. And it was short-lived, though. I think it's about 46 hours, 48 hours for a fever. And so that was great. There were no reports of myocarditis, but we expected that. These clinical trials are just too small to pick up such a rare event. But the good news is we haven't seen a safety signal from the 5 to 11-year-olds for myocarditis compared to adolescents. And we think that's because those little kiddos don't have so many hormones circulating throughout their body. And it's just myocarditis is very different for these young kids than the older kids. So we're actually not entirely worried about it, but we are going to keep an eye on that data for sure going forward, just to make sure. So that's the safety. Oh, there was no deaths in the clinical trials. There were 2 kiddos that had a pretty bad fever, one after Pfizer, one after Moderna. One had a seizure because of that fever, went to the ER. The other kid had a high fever and was actually hospitalized. But they both went to go get their second dose and didn't have a bad reaction to that. So we're going to keep an eye on those fevers as well. So vaccines are safe. The second thing that these clinical trials test is effectiveness. And in these little kid trials, we don't look at efficacy like we did with the adult trials. Instead, we look at this thing called immunobridging, which basically just means, does the vaccine mount the same amount of antibodies compared to adults? Because we already know the vaccine works among adults. We just need to make sure the dosage is right for these kiddos. And so they did. These antibodies were the same as adults and even exceeded some adult trials, which was great. And both manufacturers also did test efficacy, even though they didn't have to. And they found that Moderna's efficacy was about 50%, 40 to 50% after that second dose against infection, which is pretty fantastic against Omicron. And then Pfizer's was about 80% efficacy after the third dose. This was high, and we are honestly a little uncertain whether 80% is the true number. That's just because there's so few kids that got infected during this trial that it was variable. But that's kind of the lowdown on the clinical trials.
Yeah. Yep. I would just add a couple of things, which is that, to reiterate that overall, lots of kids had typical post-vaccine side effects like headache, fever, irritability, sleepiness, sore arm, crying when they got the vaccine. But there were really very few cases where the kid, even had to see a physician in order to deal with side effects from the vaccine. And in general, those more serious adverse events were the same across the placebo group, who actually did not get any vaccine active ingredients, and the vaccine group. So that's how we know from the trial data that the vaccines are safe for these kiddos. So I think we're just going to open it up and answer some cold questions. And we're getting a few
Let's do it.
coming in now. I'm going to shoot this one at you first, which came in on Dear Pandemic. Is the recommendation to wait after an infection to get the vaccine? So if your kid already got infected, how long do we wait? 2 to 3 months? Sooner? What do you think?
It's a really good question. And they actually addressed this during the ACIP, the CDC meeting after the FDA meeting. And the CDC said, yeah, you can wait up to 90 days if you want, up to 3 months, but you don't have to. And you can get it as soon as 10 days after your active infection. And I don't know, I have mixed feelings about this. You know, if my girls were infected back December, and so I didn't want to wait for the vaccine at all. We think that infection-induced immunity works pretty darn well these first 3 months. The challenge we're seeing right now, though, is that Omicron keeps mutating. And those infected with that first strain of Omicron, or even the second, BA1 or BA2, it's not working well against BA4 or BA5, which is really ramping up in the United States. And so I honestly wouldn't wait, but you certainly could. Certainly wouldn't wait over 3 more months. I don't know if you have a different perspective, Malia.
No, I have the same perspective. The CDC recommendation is that you can get vaccinated as soon as your symptoms are resolved, as soon as you're not infected anymore. And given what we saw about the antibody levels from kids who got infected, the kids actually don't produce a lot of antibodies after they get infected. And you could see that in the clinical trial data for these vaccines. Actually, they showed side effects according to the antibody levels pre-vaccine. So people in the trials who had already been infected versus people who had never been infected before. And actually the antibody levels for kids who had been infected were super low. So I would definitely get a vaccine for my kids. It can't hurt and it can only help. And in fact, the data showed it helped quite a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's several reasons. And like you said, protection isn't guaranteed if you get infected, and especially among kids, because typically kids get the more mild, and disease severity really predicts protection, like antibodies and T cells. And so I would just get it. Okay, let's see here. Lila, from your local epidemiologist. Hello, I'm from Washington, beautiful state. I am interested in vaccine efficacy data, waiting 4 weeks versus waiting 8 weeks between the doses. Malia, did you wait between your kids' doses?
No, I did not. So my kids are older. They're 8 and 11. They were 7 and 11 when they got their primary series back in October, and they got Pfizer, of course. That was what was available for them, and they got them on schedule. That was, what was happening at that time was the Delta wave was cresting, and Omicron we could see coming, and I really wanted to get them as protected as possible before those things happen. So we did not wait at all. I will say, I think, there's some trade-offs here to be made between having your kids have a little more protection now versus having better protection with a longer wait. I can't predict the future. Nobody can, but I think what we're seeing, across the data, big picture, is that a longer gap between your first and second dose is actually better in terms of the amount of immune response that you mount. What you have to worry about is what's going to happen in between those doses. And what we saw from the Moderna data, from the Pfizer data, was that actually the first 2 doses produced almost no protection. And so, I don't know, it's hard. It's just a tough call to make, whether you want to get as many doses as possible in and complete the series now versus, take the chance that you could get COVID in the meantime and wait 8 weeks, which might ultimately produce better immunity. What do you think?
Yeah. I think it's an interesting discussion point. And the reason we know that the 8 weeks works longer than the prescribed 3 weeks is because the UK is actually doing that. They are delaying the dosage, at least for adults. I know. I don't know what their plans are with the kids, but um, and they are seeing pretty robust response, waiting that out. And we're not too surprised about that. Other vaccines that do have a little more time in between the boosters. The second dose is basically a booster, does present more broad protection. The reason we didn't do this in the beginning, like the pharmaceutical companies just did these 3 weeks, is because we were losing like 3,500 people a day. Like we just needed these vaccines out. And that was completely the right call. And so I don't know. There's different ways to approach it. I will say my girls just got vaccinated yesterday, both under 5. I'm going to stick to schedule. I think that we are in the middle of a surge right now. There's another surge coming of BA4 or BA5. We don't know how high that's going to be. And so I just want them to mount their protection. And I know that probably another booster is coming for them anyways.
So that was the other point that I was going to bring up, is that, I think both of these vaccines, we will be looking at boosters in the fall one way or the other anyhow. And so, it might not be worth really perseverating over it if you know that there's going to be another vaccine coming in the fall.
It'll be interesting what happens in the fall, because how it's been in the past is you need 4 to 5 months after that original series. And it'll be interesting to see if that's still required. I guess the ones that are just getting vaccinated now should be in the clear for fall. But those that kind of wait a little longer may not be.
They may have to wait for the booster as well.
Yeah. We'll see. Okay, good question. Let's see.
Yeah. Is it my turn or yours?
It's your turn.
To ask you. All right. From Emily, on your local epidemiologist. So how will you weigh the risks for your kids now that they've been vaccinated? So with still fairly low protection from infection after these vaccines, are you worried about long COVID? Can you let go of all the worry? How will you feel about it going forward?
Oh, that's such a good question. I will say, getting their vaccine yesterday, it felt like getting to some sort of finish line, honestly. It's something that I have been waiting for forever. I recognize that the risk is smaller than adults, but as a mom, I want to do everything I can that they're not in the numerator. And this is now a vaccine preventable disease for them. And so I do know, though, the clinical trials, like Malia said, kids are not protected after this first dose, especially with Omicron. And so same behaviors as before. With Pfizer, same behaviors until that third dose, really, truly. And so I think the real question is what after the full series, how will my behaviors change? I don't know if they will. They are at daycare, where the daycare requires the adults to be vaccinated. During surges, they're wearing masks. And I don't know, I guess we're just living our life normally. I mean, I think we're always just going to be using antigen tests when we're sick, and wearing masks in public when we're in surges, and just really riding these waves. And I don't know if that's going to change very, very soon. And I am okay with that, because it's just normal to us now.
Yeah. Part of what I'm hearing in Emily's question is the worry, just all of the worry that we've had, and the mental health burden of having to stress about it, and so I really feel, I understand it feels like, God, wouldn't it be great to go back to the naive times of January 2020, before we didn't have these worries anymore. I don't know that they're really going anywhere anytime soon. Unfortunately, COVID-19 is going to be with us for some time.
Yeah, SARS-CoV-2 is now in our repertoire of risks in our everyday life, and it will be. I think we have to figure out ways to where to place that in our risk calibration, which is really hard because it's new. And we don't necessarily think about the risk of going in the car every day, but there are risks to that. And so I think how I've been moving forward is thinking about it like that. And there's sometimes I'm willing to take the risks, and sometimes I'm just not. And I think that with the girls' vaccine, it will help me mentally with my mama hat on a lot. And I think that's just different for every parent, and we have to allow space for that or not.
Yeah.
It's tough.
Well, and the thing that I think about a lot from this, the public health perspective on this is what can we do? You can't eliminate the risk or the worry, but it helps me to stop worrying when I know I've done what I can, right? So I don't let my kids ride in cars without seatbelts on, and I get my kids vaccinated. Those are the things that I can do. In situations where there's a lot of people in indoor spaces, we are still wearing masks. We've let go of masks. Now that my whole family's vaccinated, we've let go of masks in a lot of other settings, but when we're inside, we still wear them. We
Yeah,
do what we can.
exactly. And yeah, and you try and just break transmission chains. I mean, my girls still have their great grandparents around, and so we saw them last weekend, and we all took antigen tests before we saw him,
Sure.
and it was great. It's a great
Yeah,
tool,
that's
and
exactly what you can do, right?
exactly. What we can control. Okay, Malia, this question has your name all over it. Randy, what can be done to effectively combat anti-vaccine aggression? It's a
Oh
loaded
my.
question.
Randy, it's a great question. I've been studying vaccine hesitancy and the growth of vaccine hesitancy for a long time. And so, although it wasn't a total surprise to me that there was so much pushback on the COVID-19 vaccine and still is so much pushback, I was surprised by its by how tangled up the COVID-19 vaccine became in politics. And I think this has been truly a disaster for public health. It's also led to people really falling for some misinformation that is harming their health and the health of the population too. What we can do to combat anti-vaccine aggression, I like to tell people one effective strategy if you meet someone who wants to argue about it. No one's mind has ever been changed by getting into a heated debate and that ends in calling names and rising blood pressure, right? I really recommend finding something you can agree on. Many people who have questions about these vaccines are worried about them, are genuinely interested in their children's well-being and safety, right? And we can all agree that kids' well-being and safety is our priority. And so one thing I recommend is to lean into the things that you can agree on, and don't take the bait to get into arguments about it, because I find that really generally quite unhelpful. Bigger picture, what can be done? Social media is a huge problem in terms of spreading misinformation, not just about COVID-19, but about all kinds of health and social problems. And I don't know the solution to that problem, but it's become really clear to me as someone who accidentally waded into the social media space 2.5 years ago that it's can be really damaging. The misinformation flies on social media in a way that the truth just doesn't. And so, here I am on Facebook Live to tell you that I think social media is the problem.
Malia, do you think that this uptick in hesitancy around the COVID-19 vaccine is going to spread into other childhood vaccines?
I do, yeah.
Yeah.
I think all of this attention and the political polarization of the topic of vaccines and public health broadly is going to be really damaging for vaccine rates and for other vaccine rates too. Again, I can't predict the future. Hopefully I'm wrong on that one.
You have a magic 8 ball though.
I don't have it with me. I'm in New Jersey. Sorry.
Yeah, I know. I think so too. I saw that for the first time in a while. We went under the 95% threshold for kids that got their measles vaccine. And I think it's like
Yeah.
94%. So just barely, but it'll be interesting to continue to watch that trend. I know a lot of that is because people just missed their well child check visits during
Yeah.
2020, which is understandable. But I think we need to do a lot of work to get them up to date, and also start educating, right? Like, what is the MMR vaccine, and how can we make it a little more comfortable for parents? We're seeing that with monkeypox right now, too.
I know. Yeah. Yes, there are some hints that it's spilling over into other vaccines already, but as you say, it's unclear exactly what's going on there. I won't be surprised if we see, especially flu. Flu is a vaccine that you have to get every year, and so you have to do something every year in order to stay vaccinated for flu, which is challenging. And so I bet we'll see flu vaccines start to decline.
Flu vaccines, I know we're getting off topic, but they were good before I mean, for kids, I think it was what, 60, 70% uptake among kids.
Among
It was
kids.
adults that
Yeah,
weren't really taking it. So, yeah, it'll be interesting to continue to follow that.
it will be. And I find it very interesting how much a similarity there is in the misinformation across different vaccines. So a lot of times I'll see something that's, being said about COVID-19 vaccines that I'm like, wow, that sounds awfully familiar. That's the exact same thing they used to say about the flu vaccine or the HPV vaccine. And so I think there's a lot of contagion in how misinformation spreads across different vaccines and how we think about them.
Yeah,
All right,
absolutely.
back to the reader questions, though. You and I can just have a philosophical discussion about this. So, Jenny on YLE asks, my daughter is almost 3. We have a vacation in September and we won't have time for the full Pfizer series. So, is Moderna okay? Will it still keep her from severe COVID? So, she's asking a question about the difference in the efficacy estimate between Pfizer and Moderna.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And a lot of people do have questions about this, but we have to be really careful in comparing the efficacy among Pfizer compared to Moderna because they're just testing different things. They're not comparable. And that's because the Pfizer vaccine, again, is this 3-dose series and Moderna is this 2-dose series. The other thing is that Moderna had a pretty large, substantial sample size in their clinical trial, and we're very confident in that efficacy number. And like I said in the beginning, we're just not confident in the Pfizer efficacy number. It could be 50% too. And so, in full disclosure, my girls got Moderna yesterday, and there's a couple reasons I did this. One is that confidence in the Pfizer efficacy just wasn't strong. Moderna gets them protected quicker than Pfizer. So Moderna, you reach the same antibody levels 6 weeks after your first shot of Moderna, but 18 weeks after Pfizer. And to me, getting them the best protection as quickly as possible during a surge was important. The other thing that was really interesting, and I'm surprised that a lot of people haven't really been talking about this, but during the FDA meeting, Moderna actually said they're testing their 3rd dose on these little ones with the Omicron variant formula. Pfizer is not doing that yet. And Moderna said that they'll have the results by end of summer. And so that may mean the 3rd dose for our little ones will actually be an Omicron variant, which will put them at the same level that likely adults will need this fall too. And to me, that was just a small positive. And yeah, I think that was it. I think that, I know both of them will protect really well against severe disease and death. There's no question about that. There are pros to Pfizer, though. I will say that I'm not all team Moderna. The pro with Pfizer is their smaller side effects. So if you don't want like pretty substantially different than Moderna, and that's because of this RNA difference. And so a lot of parents like that and resonate with Pfizer because of that. And I think that's totally reasonable.
Yeah, I did a little write-up based on a terrific report that was in Stat News last week. And I think the upshot is if your priority is to minimize side effects for your kiddos, but you don't mind having to go back for an extra appointment, then Pfizer might be the way for you to go. And if you want to take a chance on slightly higher side effects, and two appointments and a quicker time to efficacy is better, then Moderna is probably the way to go. But I don't think one of them is wrong.
Yeah, I agree. You can't make a wrong decision. I think as parents throughout this pandemic, it's been really hard because we're trying to make the best decision for our kids. But in this case, protection against severe disease and death, each one is going to work great.
Yeah.
All right, Malia, next one. So this was from Dear Pandemic page. If your kid is turning 5 in August, should they wait for the bigger dose, or just get started right away?
I would say just get started right away. The dose of vaccines is a funny thing. I think because as parents, we're used to that thing where we have to, you have to know how much your kid weighs and then look on the back of the box and figure out what the right dose is.
For
And
Tylenol?
so,
Yeah.
yeah. And so we feel like it should be very closely married to the size of our kid, right? But that's actually not how vaccine dosing works. Vaccines don't enter our bloodstream. They don't have that kind of systemic effect that Tylenol does. And the amount of active ingredient in vaccines is incredibly tiny. Even the biggest doses here that we're talking about are like, I mean, they're minuscule amounts and minuscule differences between them. And so I don't think it's really important to have the bigger dose at age 5. I think it's much more important to be protected now and get going now. And then when a booster is available, you can get the booster. It also won't keep you from getting a booster after he turns 5. So I would just start now. And what would you do?
Yeah, I would start now. Then if you start now and say their birthday is in between doses, it's really your call and the pediatrician's call what to do too. You could stick with that lower dose, or you could go up a dosage if you want. Honestly, so I would start with the dosage they are right now. Just make an appointment. If they have their birthday in the next 3-4 weeks, I honestly would probably go with the upper dose, but I think that is definitely a conversation to have with the pediatrician.
Yeah. One other thing about the dosing that may be worth highlighting. So I don't have kids in this age group, but if I did, I would have gone with Moderna. And I'll tell you why. Moderna, when they went to their trials to figure out what the best dosing was, they went to a phase 1 trial where they tested a lot of different dosing levels and then moved forward with the one that was the most promising balance of side effects and immune system response, right? Where Pfizer basically just cut their next biggest dose by into 1/10 of it and went forward with that, right? And I think we ended up at almost the same place with 3 doses of the Pfizer and 2 doses of the Moderna, but I just, from a science perspective, like the Moderna approach better, and so I would go with that. And the Moderna dose for little kids is not totally dissimilar from the bigger dose that you would get as a 5-year-old, and so there's actually not that much difference between them for Moderna. So, for what it's worth, that's where I would come down to. All right, your turn. This is one that lots of parents are asking. Marie on YLE, can you get the COVID vaccine with other 6-month vaccines, or do we have to wait and spread them out? There are a bunch of vaccines due at 6 months, as you no doubt know. And COVID-19 vaccine is now one of them. So what do you think?
It is. Yeah, you don't have to wait. It is very safe to do them all. In the very beginning of the pandemic, right when the adult vaccine rolled out, the CDC recommended waiting 2 weeks. And there was really no science or evidence behind that. They were just doing it out of extra precaution. But since
I think
then,
what they were doing is actually trying to separate other stuff that was going on. Like if you got your shingles and your COVID vaccine at the same time and got a fever, how would we know what caused it? Right. So I think early on,
Oh,
that was why
okay.
there was a separation.
Okay, there you go. But now, yeah, you don't need to separate it now. It won't do any harm. You can, if your pediatrician says, let's wait 2 weeks, I mean, that's fine. It's not that big of a deal. I think as a parent, I would hate going back to the office and having another screaming child 2 weeks later, but you certainly don't have to wait. That's very apparent. All
Probably depends
right.
on how many vaccines too. I mean, my kids have a limit.
Yeah, and I wish we had a pediatrician on too, because
Yeah.
I don't remember how many vaccines there were at 6 months, but getting more than two in each limb may just be a lot for the kid. Not
Yeah.
necessarily their immune system.
Yeah,
It's
no,
just
exactly. Just
that's
the
just
amount of
that sucks.
poking. It's horrible.
Yeah. And it sucks for the parent too. So
Right.
I'm not entirely sure, but great conversation to have with your pediatrician too. Okay. Let's see here. I haven't been paying attention to these questions coming in.
I've got a good one for you if you want me to ask you another one.
Sure, you're on
So
more on top of this than I.
Alyssa on Dear Pandemic asks, is this data on the vaccine efficacy on Omicron? Because most of the kids I know who got the vaccine also have had COVID.
That's right. So the data, interestingly, the clinical trials for those under 5 were during Omicron. And that is why these efficacy numbers are just not as great, because Omicron escapes our antibody levels really well. Now, it escapes our neutralizing antibodies pretty well, but it still protects really well against severe infection and disease, or severe disease and death. And so yeah, it was conducted during Omicron, and that's really also why we're looking at an Omicron specific booster coming in fall, because we need to really up our game against Omicron. This virus has changed a lot in 2.5 years and continues to change very quickly. And so we really need to be responsive to our immune systems to put up a good fight. I think
that's probably why the efficacy estimates that we're seeing coming out of the more of these clinical trials are lower than what we saw back in fall of 2020, when the early data were saying it was 96% efficacy. That was against an old virus. And so these vaccines were much more challenged, same vaccine, different challenge. And they went up against the Omicron variant. And so the efficacy was a little bit lower in terms of preventing infection. Still, though, very good for preventing severe disease and death, and no safety issues.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, I got one for you, Dr. Jones. Miranda on Wiley is asking, can you touch on the information circulating out there about vaccines causing developmental regression? Is there any concern about this COVID-19 vaccine that we just don't know how it can negatively impact a child's development?
Yeah, so child development and vaccines, it's one of these examples of, wow, I feel like I've heard this one before somewhere. There is no evidence that any vaccine causes developmental regression. And, based on biology, it's hard to imagine a way that really could happen. So there is misinformation circulating that vaccines can cause developmental issues in kids. That information is not based in reality. And I think it's an effective and really sticky idea because it's so scary, and the human brain is very much primed to, what we want to do is protect our children. So when you hear something really scary, are you going to go out and do that thing, or are you going to take what feels like the safer course and not do the thing? Right? We're not very rational sometimes when it comes to these scary things that we hear. So I think it's an effective piece of misinformation because it's very scary. but it's not true. There's no evidence that happens for the COVID-19 vaccine or the MMR vaccine or the HPV vaccine or for any other vaccine. So, yeah, we don't have any information that would suggest that happens at all.
Yeah, and a little more specifically, I have seen a lot of worry about infertility with COVID-19 vaccines,
Yeah.
and we see this with the HPV vaccine too.
Yes. It's like
But
the exact same story that you hear for the HPV vaccine.
it is. And, this is a newer platform. mRNA vaccines are newer. However, I don't know if people realize that we've actually been studying mRNA since the 60s. And actually, the first clinical trial with mRNA vaccine or treatments was in 2000 and I'm going to guess 2001. And the reason why we haven't had an mRNA vaccine since, it wasn't because it was dangerous in these clinical trials. It was actually because the RNA in these vaccines, they degrade really fast. And we couldn't figure out a way to get it to the cells, to give it the instructions before it degraded. And so we finally used these fat bubbles to carry the mRNA during COVID-19, and it worked, which was a huge benefit for this pandemic. And so these ingredients don't just linger around for years. The mRNA degrades within 72 hours. These fat bubbles degrade within 4 days. They literally give the instructions and they peace out. And so I think that's helpful to think through as well.
Yeah, and then when you think about how that works, what happens when you get a vaccine is that you get those instructions in the mRNA molecule. Your body gets those instructions, your immune system sees it, and then all the action actually comes from your own immune system. And so there's just not a feasible way that, that process, which is part of how your body operates every time you're exposed to any kind of a foreign material in your body, could affect development in some way that's different from just, running across a cold or a piece of dirt or any other thing that you happen to ingest.
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing is, typically, or not typically, actually, every vaccine, if there's severe side effects to that vaccine, they pop up within the first 8 weeks of getting that vaccine. And it did pop up with mRNA vaccines. We got myocarditis 1 month after the rollout of the adolescent vaccine. So our surveillance systems are working. We did identify that very quickly. And two, we just have a lot of data now, over 2 years of these rollouts that are showing very high effectiveness and very high safety. So as a parent, that makes me feel better and a lot more confident in these vaccines. Okay.
All right, I got another one for you. Miranda wants to know, she says her daughter is 3 years, 5 months. I'm pretty ready to get her vaccinated. Would you recommend vaccinating her right away, like tomorrow, or waiting a few weeks or a month or so? And I think we're talking about waiting just to see if there's something that comes up in the news after a bunch of people get this vaccine.
You could wait. I think that's fine, especially if you want to wait for that window of 8 weeks of seeing maybe a side effect pop up, a very rare one. Given that this is the last group to get vaccinated and we have a very good idea of the safety profile, the chances of that are really, really low. I think that you can wait, especially if you're worried about this, especially if your kid's been infected in the past 3 months. I think that's where I feel a little more comfortable if you wanted to wait it out. But like I said earlier, we're in the middle of a surge. I know no one's talking about it, but we are experiencing the second highest case wave since the beginning of the pandemic. And to me, I just want these kiddos to be as protected as possible. The chances of them having mild to moderate disease is pretty high, but it's random. We don't know who's going to get severe disease or not. Previously healthy kids are ending up in the hospital as well. And so you have to weigh these risks with these benefits. And to me, the benefits just continue to outweigh the risks.
Yeah, I agree. I think sooner is probably better for a lot of reasons, one of which is that you'd be protected sooner. And then, if your kid did get COVID somehow, you would know that you'd done everything you can to prevent it. Sometimes I think we forget that not vaccinating is also an action, right? It feels like, well, I'm going to do nothing and see what happens is somehow a choice that's going to lead to no consequences, but it can lead to your kiddo getting COVID. So I would do it sooner. But Caitlin's right. You could wait if it's something that's a real point of contention for you or your family.
All right, here's another one from Kara. I'm so bad with names, guys. I'm sorry. Kara, I think is how you say it. From Wiley. If I got my kids vaccinated with Pfizer for the first shot, but prefer Moderna, can I quote unquote, start over? Forget about that first one and just get them the Moderna shots. What do you think?
Gosh. So, officially, no. And you can talk to your pediatrician about, whether you might want to mix and match. There's a lot of data out there about mixing and matching in adults, not yet in children, but no doubt that will be coming down the pike. And so, if you really feel strongly about that, I would suggest talking to your pediatrician about switching to Moderna for their second and booster shots. You can't just pretend it didn't happen and start over, though. At least not in my state.
Yeah, we just don't have the data. I don't know. I would stick to the primary.
You would stick to one.
I would. Yeah. And it's not, like I said, Moderna may sound more flashy or better, but Pfizer does a great job too against severe disease and death.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, talk to your pediatrician, but officially
speaking, no. Yeah, you're supposed to stick to one. I also think, at some point, just like we've seen with the adult vaccines, it's going to be, is your kid vaccinated? And nobody's going to ask which vaccine they got when they go to get their booster, most likely. So it's not like you're stuck with Pfizer forever and ever if you're not happy with that. All right, Caitlin, from Richard on YLE, what is the COVID risk to kids 0 to 5 without the vaccine? So why are we even doing this? Aren't kids, pretty weather the storm pretty well when they get COVID?
They do. The majority of kids do. The majority of kids do get asymptomatic, mild to moderate disease, especially when we compare it to adults. I think that we've all come to the conclusion of that. But it's really, as an epidemiologist, it's flawed to compare kids to adults because kids aren't supposed to die either.
We need to compare kids to kids.
Yeah, we need to compare kids to kids. And so when we do that, there is debate on where exactly COVID ranks as a leading cause of death, but overall, it's a top 10 leading cause of death for kids. And now it's preventable, period. And so we can reduce that risk a lot easier than, for example, the other causes of death, like I'll just say gun violence.
Gun violence. And also,
so,
cancer and birth defects and the other top causes of death are much, much harder to prevent.
That's right. The other way to compare it to other kids is what do we get them vaccinated for other diseases? And COVID-19 happens to cause the most death compared to, for example, rubella or measles. And so it's pretty substantial difference too.
Yeah. Or even flu. COVID-19 has caused many more deaths amongst the pediatric population than influenza, which is, before the pandemic, influenza was the most serious infectious disease problem we faced as a population. And it's worse than that. So
that's right.
Nothing.
And then I think Richard asked, because I just found the comment you found, Malia, that what's the risk reduced?
I was just going to ask the follow-up there.
And do you want to take it?
No, you go ahead.
Well, so that's what efficacy is. It's that risk reduction. Efficacy is sometimes interpreted the wrong way. Sometimes a lot of people use it as, so say the Pfizer vaccine series is at 80% efficacy for these kids under 5. That doesn't mean there's an 80% chance they're not getting the vaccine. That 80% is the risk reduction among those that got the disease compared to those that didn't get the
vaccine
compared to those that got the placebo. Yeah, so that is the risk reduction, is that percentage. And so I think we answered that question in whole. It is an important question.
And I also just the last part of Richard's comment in here is even asking this question results in being called a troll, but it seems like a pretty important question. That's such a shame because, we need to be able to ask these questions. What are the risks and how much are they being reduced? It's really a shame that we've gotten into such a polarized place that we can't even ask questions and get answers.
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. Hopefully that helps a little.
So here's one that this is a quick answer for this one. Debbie via YLE asks, is there any data showing if mom or dad had a reaction to the vaccine, is the risk going to be higher with their child? There is no data.
I don't know that answer.
No, it's because no one knows the answer to that. As far as I know, there is no data on that. In fact, it doesn't even seem, I've never even seen family trends among adults data. It seems almost completely random who gets stronger side effects. Although there is a little bit of a trend, the older you are, the less your side effects are, but not always. I mean, my mother-in-law was laid flat for days after her vaccines, and she's 76. So no, there's no information at all. Sorry.
It would be interesting though to see like if genetics, plays a role into this.
Yeah,
or I don't know.
Would be.
Or
there's some gender effects too. Men get stronger side effects than women do, but I don't. I've never seen anything about within family.
Do they? Because my husband didn't get anything, and that vaccine, it was hard on me for the first 48 hours.
Well, but that's the average, right? I mean, on average, women report fewer side effects than men do, but none of us are, very few of us are average, right?
I was going to say women also may be tougher than men. I'm just kidding.
What?
Okay. This is a good question. How will these vaccines work against upcoming variants and surges?
Yeah, I do wish I had my magic 8-ball right now.
Yeah, so there was a really important meeting at the FDA. When was that? Is that 2 days ago now?
Yes.
That had this very discussion. Like the entire discussion was about how do we get ahead of this virus? How do we plan for what's coming in fall? The challenge is, one, this virus is mutating really fast. It's mutating 4 times faster than the flu. And so that's really difficult to predict what's coming. 2 is that this virus is still very new. It's, obviously only been with us for about 2.5 years, which is new for viruses. And so we haven't seen yet, they call it a ladder-like pattern of where this virus may be going. We may have another Omicron-like event, which is just completely random, off the cusp, like annoying. And so it's really, we can't necessarily use the same framework like we use with the flu to predict what vaccine we should have, because that's what's circulating, and this is our best chance. I will say, though, that we have a pretty good sense that Omicron will continue to mutate. And we hope, I don't know, hope, but we think that this is going to be the circulating one. I think there's like a 70% chance of that. So that's why they decided at the FDA meeting this week to have the Omicron variant, because we have to make some educated guesses. And we could be very wrong, but we could also have a pretty good chance of being right too. I also think it depends on how we define these vaccines work. The vaccines are still working really well against severe disease and death. It is waning a little, especially for these older populations, over 50, over 65. But among the younger, especially kids, this waning against severe disease is just not happening very quickly. And so I think we'll be pretty well protected throughout the winter. Do you have any thoughts?
I mean, it's really hard to know. I can offer some context about how these things work. You know, we've been dealing with this same problem with influenza since influenza vaccines became available. And flu has a very special ability to mutate in ways that disguise it from our immune system. So you have to get a flu vaccine every year, not because your last year's flu vaccine stopped working, but because the virus that's coming this year is new. It just mutates a lot. It's a very messy replicator. And so what we have done is every year there's a meeting to where all of the best scientific minds get together and show the models of what they think is coming, but they really are predicting the future. And as we have all seen, it's really hard to predict the future. And based on those decisions, they start manufacturing vaccine. We need some lead time to make the vaccine, right? And so some years the flu vaccine works quite well because those predictions were right. And other years doesn't work so well because those predictions were not right. And we just don't have a good way to know how a virus is going to mutate in the future. And it's the same for COVID-19. You know, we have to make a decision about what we're going to do in the fall for boosters. And FDA has decided to go with an Omicron-based booster rather than the older one. I think that's the right call because Omicron is still circulating really strongly, certainly more so than the original virus, right? But who knows what will happen over the summer? We really don't know.
Yeah, that's right. And we have a pretty good sense that there will be a surge in the winter. And the reason for this is, I don't know if you guys noticed, but the larger surges we've had have been during the winter. And that's because coronaviruses in this other, like cousins of SARS-CoV-2, also thrive in the winter. So that's why we're trying to be as prepared as possible. And like Malia says, we need about 3 months to manufacture and distribute these vaccines. So we had to make a decision like this week. So we'll see. I think we have one more question. Is there one that pops out to you?
Let's see.
There's a couple repeats. So if you guys that we've answered, so I think this recording is going to be available if you guys want to head rewind.
Yeah. Okay, here's a quick one. Nicole from YLE wants to know, what are the most common side effects for kids who are under 5 who get these 2 vaccines?
Yeah, great question. Number one side effect is pain at injection site. I think that was like 70% of kids. And honestly, with my 2 under 5, I'm surprised it's not 100%. That's just the vaccine. I mean, that's with every vaccine.
Yeah, you get a needle stab and then they cry.
I know. But you know, my kids, they stop crying after like 2 minutes. So beyond that is irritability. I think about 40 to 50% of kids, their parents reported irritability during the clinical trial, as well as fatigue, just being tired. You know, these are normal side effects to other vaccines too. And then we touched upon also fever. I think it's about 1 in 10 chance of getting a fever, a little higher for Moderna. So just be out on the look for that. Kids can have Tylenol. That certainly is a choice, and it won't hurt the vaccine response. But thank you guys for all of your amazing questions. Thank you, Dr. Jones. Thank you, the host of this, the COVID-19 Vaccine Education and Equity Project, for coming together and creating this space. Parents have a lot of good questions, and we're happy that you guys asked them, and we hope that was helpful. So stay tuned, and we'll hopefully answer your questions, and we'll see what happens this fall.
Thanks very much for having me.
Bye.